I never thought I would like books about church and religious leaders so much. Hello and welcome back to Bookish, and welcome to kind of an important day in my reading history. I have finished the Chronicles of Barsetshire by Anthony Trollope. I've read all 6 books, finishing the last Chronicle of Barset just today and completing that 6-book series. And I wanted to talk about those books here real quickly because I really like them, and I think it is kind of a remarkable achievement for Anthony Trollope to create this whole world, this whole fictional community of Barsetshire, and people it with all kinds of people, and create all kinds of dramatic stories and dramatic tension in this one place, and have that place seem really familiar. You know, as you read along in the books, one of the things that struck me is that you automatically kind of fall back into the world, and you kind of understand the way class functions and the way the religious structure of the Church of England functions, the way wealth kind of steps in and maybe blurs some of those class lines, the lines and the ideas that govern relationships between men and women, husband and wife, young people when they're courting or looking at getting married, the rules that apply to perhaps religious officials in terms of what they are allowed to do and what they're not allowed to do, what their honor requires them to do. And we meet people who are, you know, good and not so good. I don't know that there are a whole lot of pure evil people in the Barsetshire Chronicles. There are some, but, you know, we see people with all kinds of human failings. You know, pride, avarice, desire to move ahead, obsessive love, all kinds of these things, too much, you know, perhaps morality for their own good. We see these things affect characters across the 6 books. And so I just wanted to kind of celebrate the Barsetshire Chronicles here just a minute by talking about, you know, all 6 books and some of the other things about the books that I think stand out. Now, it is true that the books almost all focus in some way on religious leaders within the Church of England, from bishops to reverends to vicars to predentaries or whatever they're called. You know, there's a lot of kind of church politics and church hierarchy here. But one of the things that I've oftentimes thought in reading the books is that, you know, Trollope talks about church leaders and their lives, and the characters are oftentimes figures in the church, but they don't seem to do a lot of churching. And I was amused to see that at the end of the last Chronicles of Barset, Trollope actually addresses that. And what he says is that, yes, he acknowledges he didn't spend a lot of time showing these religious figures doing their religious duties. That's because he thought the books really were focused on the social aspect, the social and cultural aspect of the church and its leaders and the effect they had on the community. So I thought that was a really good answer to questions that I had. Okay, so the Barsetshire Chronicles start with the Warden. Now, technically, the Warden was not written to be an introduction to this series of books, but that's what it's became. Trollope wrote it as a standalone, and it concerns a fairly low-ranking official named Septimus Harding, who has a job. He is, you know, some kind of religious official carrying out sermons and church business, but he also runs this thing called a hospital, essentially, where essentially it's like a retirement home for men. And he runs this place, and everybody likes him, and he's an incredibly genial man who's been widowed, who loves music, who kind of involuntarily plays, you know, the viola or the cello with his fingers in moments of stress. He has 2 daughters, one of whom is married the archdeacon, and another who is still living at home and is single at the time that the novel starts. What this novel is really about is church reform efforts and how church reform efforts might have affected somebody like Mr. Harding. Come to find out, a young crusading man whose last name is Bold, and names in Trollope are oftentimes incredibly good, but Charles Bold, I believe his first name is Charles, is a church reformer, and he believes that a lot of money is being wasted, and a lot of church officials are getting money for doing things they shouldn't be getting money for, or getting way more money than they should. And one of those people is, in fact, Septimus Harding, that he gets paid a whole lot for this hospital job, this maintaining this retirement home for these men, and that then sets in motion the events of this novel, which involves, you know, whether or not Mr. Harding's going to keep the job, whether his conscience can. We're introduced to the Archbishop Grantley. We're introduced to his wife, who's Harding's elder daughter. We're introduced to his younger daughter. We're introduced to Mr. Bold. There's this really kind of long section where, Trollope is kind of taking, I think, genial shots at Dickens and at, I've just forgotten his name. Anyway, at two kind of prominent literary figures in England at the time as being on opposite sides of this issue. And it's a really effective and I think, nice short introduction to the works of Anthony Trollope. And it kind of lays the groundwork, creates the framework for the rest of the books. The second book in the series is Barchester Towers. This one is my favorite. It's my favorite because it brings in a huge cast of characters. And it really kind of creates the framework around which a lot of the other stories are set in a much more detailed way. So this novel involves a new bishop of Barchester being appointed, and the Archbishop Grantley, who you'll remember is related to Mr. Harding through marriage. The Archbishop Grantley's dad had been the bishop, and so the Archbishop thinks he will just move in that job. That's not what happens. A new bishop is appointed, and his last name is Prouty, and Mr. Prouty, or Bishop Prouty, has a wife who's referred to as Mrs. Prouty, and she is a piece of work. She is opinionated, she's loud, she's bold, she's powerful, she's intrusive, she's rude, she is, judgmental, and this automatically then, exacerbates what would already probably be a division between the Bishop Grantley, who wanted the job, and his family, and the people close to him, and the Bishop Prouty. This then becomes kind of one of the mainstays of the Barsetshire Chronicles as a whole, is this division between the Grantley Archdeacon faction and the Bishop Prouty faction within the church and within the community. There's also, I think a really interesting kind of, I'm going to call it a romantic or a love story built in here that is incredibly complicated and involves an outrageous young woman who's called home by the bishop at the request of his wife, calls his relatives home, and I believe his niece is this young woman who's been married to an Italian, and she just kind of wreaks havoc on the social scene in Barchester and almost wins away perhaps the love interest of Eleanor Bold, whose husband, Charles Bold, has died in the interim between the Warden and Barchester Towers. And this introduces to one of the great villain characters, probably one of the few, I think, actual evil characters in the Barsetshire Chronicles, and that is Obadiah Slope. What an incredible name. And while I'm talking about names in this section, I'll just point out that referring to the bishop's name being Prouty and his wife being Prouty is perfect because they're very proud, or she's a very proud person. And then Eleanor Bold, who is Mr. Harding's daughter, who has been widowed. I have a feeling that Trollope had her marry a man named Charles Bold just so she could be called Eleanor Bold, because she is quite a bold character. Then we get to the third book in the series, and that's Dr. Thorne. And Dr. Thorne begins kind of a run of two novels in a row that are not really my favorite. So Dr. Thorne, as the name implies, involves a doctor named Thomas Thorne, whose brother was a scoundrel and ended up being killed in an act of violence because he had done wrong to a woman who's going to have a child, and Dr. Thorne is going to end up raising that child, who is his niece. But her identity is not necessarily well known. And the fact that she stands to inherit a large amount of money is also not necessarily well known. And so what we get here in Dr. Thorne is really kind of a smaller story, which is kind of focusing on the problems of the nobility who have title but not money, and their relationship to people without title but with money, and how the need for money in these kind of family estates and these kind of noble families drives marriage choices for young men, and how sometimes those young men might buck that system and marry someone else anyway, and it all work out. But that's kind of Dr. Thorne. My favorite named character from Dr. Thorne is a rival doctor whose name is literally Dr. Filgrave, which that's just all one word, Dr. Filgrave. Great name there. What are we on now? There's a fourth book in the series, is Framley Parsonage, and I think on the whole this is my least favorite of the books, but it probably is the one that's most important to understanding the last book in the series, The Last Chronicle of Barset. So this novel focuses on the vicar of Framley Parsonage. He's a man named Mark Robarts, and Mark Robarts is very good friends with the son of a woman whose name, what was their last name, is Lumsden, sorry. He is connected to and got his job through his friendship with this guy's lord, or I don't know, duke or something, Lumsden, and his mom is a widow and controls kind of this part of Barsetshire and has a lot of influence. And so Robarts got his job through her and through that family connection. But Robarts makes a mistake. He is too casual with money to begin with. He buys things he really can't afford. He's easily talked into spending money he can't afford to spend, and he signs a bill of debt certifying he'll pay a debt if another person defaults. And so when that other person defaults, Reverend Robarts is in danger of being arrested and put in prison for debt, saved kind of at the last minute. But more importantly, or equally importantly than, sorry, not equally, but importantly then for, as I was saying, the last novel in the series, this also introduces to the Reverend Crawley and his family, his wife, his daughters, Grace and Jane, and the poverty in which they live in. He is the perpetual curate, I believe is the name of it, of the church at a place called Hogglesback or something like that, and he is desperately, desperately poor. And so what we get is then, in looking at the way the church is structured, we see the disparity in pay. Someone like Robarts, who gets a position which is well paid, is well off, and yet he almost squanders that. And someone like Crawley is desperately trying just to, make ends meet and keep his family fed and housed. And yet, Mr. Crawley is probably the far better church official than Mr. Robarts, and this kind of back and forth and the pride of Mr. Crawley really begins to show up here in a way which will be important later. The fifth book in the series is The Small House at Allington, and this is probably, I think, the most charming of the books, but at the same time, the most sad of the books, I think. As with most, of the books in the series, there are a lot of characters, and there are different plot lines. But the main one involves a young woman named Lily Dale. She is the youngest daughter of a woman who was widowed to a man named Dale, and she has an older sister. And they live in this small house at Allington, essentially at the pleasure or because of the charity of Mrs. Dale's dead husband's brother. So her brother-in-law allows him to live in this house, and that creates tension, and that creates a situation where they're always in poverty, and it kind of puts Lily Dale at maybe the lowest socioeconomic level that you could be, and be someone of name and be considered a lady or a gentlewoman. That's kind of where she is. There's a young man in the area named John Eames who's desperately in love with her, and it appears as though that might be, her destiny to marry John Eames, even though she thinks of him more as a brother and a friend than as a romantic partner, until a young man named Adolphus Crosby comes into this community. He falls in love with Lily Dale. She falls in love with him. And then, a kind of a minor romantic tragedy follows, which is bad for everybody involved in the story. And there probably isn't a story, I think, in this cycle that ends on a sadder note than that, or maybe a less satisfying note than that. Which then brings me to the sixth book in the series, which I just finished yesterday, and that's The Last Chronicle of Barset. And essentially this novel attempts to bring together all the loose ends and all the plot points and provide resolution to all the characters who we've learned about throughout reading the other 5 books. So you can expect that there'll be little bits about almost everybody, I think, who's appeared in the Barsetshire Chronicles will appear here. And really, the novel revolves around Mr. Crawley. You remember the curate of Hogglestock or Hoggleback or whatever it is, the really poor guy, has been accused and charged with stealing a check, that he had found a check and apparently used to pay a bill when that check had been lost by someone else. And this then leads to a scandal which creates even more division within the communities around Barchester, which divides the archdeacon more firmly from Bishop Prouty, which leads his wife to get involved, which has tragic consequences. And we see all these characters kind of come back and have some kind of resolution. Those resolutions are not always positive. As a matter of fact, you're listening to what I said about the small house at Allington. That situation does not get resolved in a way which you could classify as a happy ending, but there are lots of happy endings here. I found the book to be really moving in lots of ways. And one of the most moving parts of it, I thought, had to do with Mr. Harding and Mr. Harding's decline towards his inevitable death. There were some really moving passages about aging and sadness that I thought were just incredibly powerful. In this book, in the last Chronicles of Barset, my favorite name is a lawyer whose last name is Toogood, because he is in fact Toogood. Anyway, I just found the whole series to be really great. I really enjoyed reading it. This has been one of my favorite, Victober experiences that I've taken on. I think I've read one of these books every year since I've been on BookTube, and I'm happy that I am. I think if you're, someone thinking about starting reading Trollope, I think The Warden is a pretty good place to start. You can read it as a standalone and not go on, but if you do read it, it's a good introduction to the rest of the books in the series. Most of which I thought were excellent, and the ones I didn't think were excellent, I thought were good. Anyway, if you read these books, have thoughts about what I've said in this video, please let me know in the comment section down below. And as always, thank you for watching.